So, in this presentation, we are going to explain how to integrate GNSS stations in Epos. So, my name is Carine Bruyninx. I'm the chair of the executive board of the GNSS component of Epos, and the presentation that I'm going to show you has been compiled with the help of my colleagues, Andras Fabian, Anna Miglio, and Juliette Legrand. We are all working at the World Observatory of Belgium, and within Epos, we are responsible for integrating GNSS stations in Epos, hence the presentation I am giving here. So we already showed you this flow chart, and we are going to focus, in fact, on the part about the M3G center here. And this is the place where you are inserting new station metadata in Epos. It is indicated by the black circle on the diagram. And it is not only the entry point for all station managers, but also for all new station managers, but also the entry point for every station manager wishing to update its station metadata in Epos. And then from M3G, these metadata will flow to the Epos data gateway, from where they are distributed throughout the full Epos delivery framework. As we already mentioned, Epos is presently in a pre-operational or pilot operational phase. And in practice, this means that all our services are not fully operational. The Epos GNSS network is still under construction. The data flow is still being set up for a lot of stations, and products are still being refined. The services that are working are currently under tests, and one of the goals of this webinar is also exactly to get your feedback on what is already in place. So we are very busy at the moment to construct the Epos GNSS station network and inserting new GNSS stations in Epos. Now today we know that there are about 5,000 GNSS stations in Europe that are routinely used for high precision applications. And up to recently, only the data of about 400 of them were centrally made available thanks to the efforts of EUREF. Now the goal of Epos is to increase this number and try to provide centralized access to the data from about 3,000 stations. This is a very ambitious goal, and it will take several years to reach this number. In addition, of course, not all GNSS station operators are willing to share their data. But Epos has tried to take the concerns of station managers into account by allowing a lot of flexibility for the data provision. And as you will see, we are slowly progressing. So today, 1,145 stations have already expressed their interest to contribute to the Epos network, and you can see them in the map. You can also see in this map that some countries have really embraced Epos, while others still have to come aboard and only have a couple of stations included in Epos. So what do we expect from these GNSS stations joining Epos? So what are the general station requirements? Well, Epos is presently only considering permanently tracking GNSS stations. These stations, they can be active at this very moment, but also decommissioned stations that operated in the past for at least 3 years are of interest to Epos. This is because Epos will regularly reprocess all GNSS data to compute station velocities. The minimal requirement, however, is that the daily Bruyninx data of the stations are freely made available to Epos, and that the station metadata, such as the site log, you all well known, are kept up to date and also provided to Epos. The most recent list of Epos stations can be consulted from our M3G website. M3G stands for Metadata Management and Distribution System for Multiple GNSS Networks. And as I already mentioned, it is the central point where station managers from both Epos, but also from the EUREF network, submit their station metadata. It also guarantees this way that exactly the same station metadata are available independently to which network the station contributes. In the left column, for example, of the homepage of M3G in this slide, you can follow live, not live because this is a screenshot, of course, but on the website you can see it live, which station metadata are updated. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to briefly browse through the main menu of M3G, because this information will help you later on to integrate your stations in Apos. So first of all, we come to the agencies part of M3G. This agencies part provides you the list of the agencies that are maintaining the metadata of their GNSS stations in M3G. So in the bottom right in the circle, you can see that we have 127 items, meaning that today 127 agencies have an account in M3G to maintain the station metadata. Most of the stations are located in Europe, of course, because we are mainly serving Europe and Apos. However, M3G also accepts metadata from stations that are not contributing to any international GNSS network. So in fact, we could store metadata of any station anywhere in the world. In addition to the name of the agency and its country, you can also check in this webpage to which international networks the agency is contributing. Then, for example, the BKG agency has stations contributing to the EPN densification, and Apos networks. And if you click on the plus sign here, you will get the list of their stations. If a station is indicated in blue, this means that the site log of the station has been inserted in M3G. And by clicking on the blue station, you can have a look at the station details, including a map with the station location and the site log. The next section provides the list of all the stations that maintain their metadata in M3G. Today, we have almost 2,600 stations, including, of course, the 1,145 Apos stations. For each station, you can see the network to which the station contributes, if the station is still active, where the station is located, which constellations are tracked, and also, again, by clicking on the station name, you will get all the station details. I would like to draw your attention to the last column where you can see the data license. These are the standard Creative Commons data licenses that we use. And in the table, for example, one station has not set up his data license here. And if you look closely on the line of the station, you will see that this station is not contributing to Apos, while the others do. And in fact, for Apos stations, it is mandatory to provide information on the license of use of the data. This is Apos data policy. But for EPN and EPN densification stations, this information, for example, must not be mandatory entered in M3G. So I will explain more about that later. The next section is the Metadata Catalog. This catalog allows you to filter the stations for which you want to download the metadata or create a new metadata catalog. So I quickly move on. Then we have the Apos data nodes. I am not sure if I will reply to your question, David, but if I don't, then you can again answer it after my presentation. So in this section of data nodes, these are the ones, of course, that will ensure the data from the Apos stations will become available to Apos. And when you will propose a station to Apos, you will have to decide which of the nodes that you will make your data available to. We have presently 11 registered data nodes. Not all are fully operational today. There are a couple of nodes serving dedicated networks. There are 2 pan-European nodes, one for Europe and one for the Apos stations. And then we have several national data nodes, which are collecting all the data from the Apos stations in their country. Now let me continue with the, with the network section. This gives an overview of the different networks supported by M3G. And so in addition to the international EPN densification, and Apos networks, M3G also allows stations to link with a local or national network that the user can set up in M3G. Apos strongly encourages that Apos stations are linked to a national or local network, and also to associate the digital object identifier, or DOI, to the data of the network. This DOI will enable the user of the data to easily cite the data provider. At the moment, few networks have a DOI, as you will see, but it is expected that this number will grow as the international GNSS community, and more specifically GGOS, is presently discussing a standardization of the DOIs for GNSS data. Then we come to the documentation part. So this documentation part first contains a quick start on how to use M3G, a section with frequently asked questions, as well as information on how metadata inserted in M3G can be downloaded. This download can be done through the web interface, through an anonymous FTP, or through APIs. And in the documentation, you will also find detailed description of the M3G APIs, including some examples on how to use them. Now, in the following of this presentation, we are going to focus on the guidelines part of the documentation, and more specifically on the procedure for including GNSS stations in EPOS, which is the first document, as you can see, in the list of guidelines. Now, all stations that have been proposed so far to Apos have used this stepwise procedure of the guidelines. The procedure is explained in detail, as you can see here in the PDF link, and you just see the first page of the procedure. And we will now go step by step through it, so that after this presentation, you can, or I hope you can, easily integrate your GNSS stations in Apos. When you will browse through the procedure, you will see that we first recommend you to contact us, the M3G team, at m3g@oma.be before you get started, so that in case you have questions, we can really guide you through each step of the procedure. The very first step is, of course, to check if your stations are suitable to be included in Apos. You know that Apos, I think we already mentioned it, has an open data policy, and the document with the detailed Apos data policy can be consulted also from the M3G web portal. You can see the link here. This means, of course, that we expect that the stations will make their daily Bruyninx data available and keep the site log up to date. So let's now look at the detailed station guidelines. Also, they can be found from the M3G website. These detailed station guidelines have, of course, been inspired by the UF and IGS guidelines. It doesn't make any sense to reinvent the hot water, but they are less strict because we want to have much more stations included. So in practice, this means that if a station already fulfills the UF or IGS guidelines, then it will certainly also fulfill the Apos guidelines. But an Apos station may not necessarily be suitable for integration in the UF or IGS network. The Apos guidelines mainly focus on requirements that ensure a proper analysis and interpretation of the data. For example, it is not necessary to provide multi-GNSS data, and also the usage of the DOMS number is not mandatory, although it is strongly recommended. Also concerning the antenna calibrations, Apos is less strict. For example, within IGS and UF, antenna calibrations need to exist for the antenna radome pair, while in Apos it is sufficient to have antenna calibrations for the antenna only. Apos also does not request to provide information about the elevation cutoff setting in the receiver, because for a lot of potential Apos stations, this historical information was lost over time. And finally, Apos, but that you know in the meantime already, only requests the submission of daily Bruyninx 2 or Bruyninx 3 data, while UF, for example, requests submissions of daily and hourly data, and strongly recommends the submission of real-time data. Of course, some of the Apos guidelines are similar to IGS and UF. The equipment, receiver, antenna, radome must be known to the IGS so that it has a standard name. Antenna and radome and antenna height changes must be documented carefully in the site log. And finally, the Apos guidelines, similar to the IGS and UF guidelines, contain best practices for station monumentation, but in practice, these are not used as a criteria to not accept station in the network. The second step of the procedure, there are 7 steps for those of you who get impatient. The second step consists of understanding how Apos deals with the different agency responsibilities. Apos requires that all the agencies that are proposing a GNSS station to be included in their network, they sign a so-called Apos data supplier letter. We will give later on more details about this letter. And it is important to understand that this letter has to be signed by the so-called data supplier agency. And this is the agency that has the full ownership rights over the data, or that decides to keep the station alive or not, and which is responsible also for providing the data to Apos. The data supplier does, however, not necessarily have to be a single agency. We thought about that in the beginning, but in fact, during the course of the integration of the already existing Apos stations, we realized that a couple of stations, they are co-owned by agencies or they are operated by a consortium. So all that is possible, of course. So in addition to the data supplier, Apos also needs to know which agency will maintain the station metadata in M3G. And we call that agency the operational center. Of course, in the majority of cases, it is the same agency who is acting as a data supplier or an operational center, but it is not always the case. And just to give you an example, I give you a practical case from Belgium, real life. So in Belgium, so far, 2 agencies agreed to make their GNSS data available to Apos. So we have on one hand, the Royal Observatory of Belgium, and on the other hand, the Flemish Information Agency. Now, this means that each of them is an Apos data supplier, and each of them has signed the Apos data supplier letter. However, while the observatory is maintaining itself the metadata of its GNSS stations in M3G, the Flemish Information Agency did not wish to do it themselves because they are not so familiar with the maintenance of site logs. So they asked us, the observatory, to do it for them. And in practice, each time the Flemish Information Agency changes something in one of its stations, they are just sending an email to us and we update the site log in M3G. So in this specific case, the observatory is the operational center for both its own stations as the stations owned by the Flemish Information Agency. And in practice, only the observatory will get an account on M3G where it can maintain the metadata of both networks. For the stations owned by the Flemish Information Agency, the observatory will indicate in M3G that these are third-party stations for ROB, that ROB is not owning these stations itself. Step 3. Step 3 consists, very simple, preparing the list of stations that you will propose to Apos. You need to collect the station 9 character identification codes. These are the Bruyninx 3 station naming conventions that we use, which is the 4 character station ID, a 00, and the 3 character ISO country code. Although theoretically allowed, the same 4 character ID can be used for stations in different countries, but we strongly discourage doing so because the international community, including Apos, still has difficulties to properly handle stations with duplicate 4 character abbreviations. And as you will see also in the written procedure, this procedure will contain a couple of links that can help you to check if the 4 character abbreviation code of a station is already in use or not. Now that you have the list of stations that are meeting the Apos station requirements and you identified which agency is data supplier and which one is operational center for your stations, the next step will be to identify how you are going to provide your data to Apos. This will consist of selecting, on one hand, the most appropriate Apos data node, and in addition, identify if you are going to have restrictions on your data distribution and access. So to make your data available to Apos, you know that now in the meantime, you need to make them discoverable to an Apos data node. So how do you choose the optimal Airpost data node? So first, EPN stations do not need to choose a data node because there is already an interface between the EPN historical data center at HOP and Apos. So this means that the data of the EPN stations that have signed the Airpost data supplier letter will be automatically made available to Airpost through the HOP URF node. For non-EPN stations, it will be necessary to reflect if you wish to install yourself an Airpost data node, which is in most cases not necessary for small networks, or you will take advantage of one of the already existing Airpost data nodes. As I showed in the beginning, M3G provides an overview of the Airpost data nodes, and some of the data nodes are indeed still under construction, but this does not mean that you cannot already select them. And when selecting a node, we recommend to first check if there is a national Airpost data node in your country. And in fact, M3G provides for each node a description of the node, and this description contains information if the node is prepared to take on the data from all Airpost stations in its country. If your node does not have a national node, then the alternative is to provide your data to the dedicated Airpost pan-European node in Portugal. And the exact way of providing the daily data to the node is decided by the node and the data supplier together. During the node selection step, we recommend you to keep in touch with the M3G team so that we can assist you to select the optimal node for your specific case. To be as inclusive as possible, Apos allows to put restrictions on your data distribution and data access. I mean inclusive as possible, inclusive to get as much as possible data providers. So for example, in some exceptional cases, the data supplier has an agreement with a specific Airpost data node and only accepts that this specific data node distributes its GNSS data to Airpost. This is allowed in Airpost, and Annex C of the Airpost GNSS data supplier letter allows the data supplier to explicitly indicate this restriction. In practice, very few data suppliers so far have put restrictions on the data distribution. A second type of potential restrictions are related to the data access. These restrictions are in fact important for all Airpost stations because they concern data licenses and embargo periods. At the moment, only one Airpost data supplier has used an embargo period to make its data available to Airpost, but it is allowed. And this data supplier makes its daily data only available to Airpost after 18 months after the actual observation. And applying such an embargo period can especially be interesting for data suppliers who operate a commercial GNSS network. But remember, we are just talking here about daily Bruyninx data. They are much less interesting, of course, from a commercial point of view than real-time data. Then we come to the licenses part. So the data license is something that all data suppliers will have to consider. Because if they do not yet have a data license on their data, then Airpost will by default affix the CC BY license on the data. Of course, Airpost will do that on behalf of the data supplier. Now, what does it mean in practice? CC BY is one of the standard Creative Commons data licenses, and it says that anyone is allowed to use the data for any application, but when using the data and producing a paper or results, the user needs to acknowledge or cite the data provider, the data supplier. And the way this acknowledgement can best be done is by using the DOI of the network of the data supplier. And remember, in the first part of this presentation where I showed you M3G, there was a part about the networks, and I explained that it was possible to insert a DOI of a network in Apos. Well, this DOI is exactly there to allow a user to cite the data. Now, I'm not going to say more about DOIs, but if someone wants to get more information, then feel free to contact the M3G team and we will try to help you. So, however, if, of course, the data supplier already has a data license on its data, or CC BY and C, for example, no commercial applications, then this is also possible as long as this data license is consistent with the Airpos data policy and the CC BY no commercial applications is consistent with the Airpos data policy. In case you doubt or you are using some specific national data license, again, please free to contact us and we will check together if it is compatible with the Airpos accepted data licenses. So now that you have completed the first four steps, you are ready to complete the Airpos GNSS data supplier letter. So a template of the letter that can be retrieved from the M3G website in the guidelines section, and the link is also shown here on the slide. The letter needs to be completed and signed by the data supplier, so the agency having full ownership rights on the station data. On the first page of the letter, the information about the data supplier must be provided, and the data supplier will give Airpos the permission to affix on its behalf the CC BY license on the data. The data supplier also needs to give Airpos permission to redistribute the data. In Annex A of the data supplier letter, you will provide the list of stations proposed to Airpos and also indicate for each station the operational center that will maintain the metadata in M3G. This is important because M3G needs to know who has the authority to upload and edit station metadata. In Annex B, the data supplier will provide contact information of the operational center, and in Annex C, the data supplier can indicate if it wants to restrict the distribution of its data to a specific Airpos data node. As you can see, the data supplier letter does not require information about embargo times and existing data licenses. The reason for that is that this information has to be entered later on for each station in M3G by the operational center. So once you completed the letter, you can send the draft letter to Airpos, to M3G. We recommend you not to get it signed straight away, but just send us a draft and wait for our feedback. Sometimes little things are not clear and need to be fine-tuned. And once you get our feedback, then you can have it signed, and it is up to you to decide who is signing the letter. For universities, in my personal opinion, and I have seen it not done before, it is not necessary that the dean or whoever signs the letter. As long as the person responsible for the network is signing the letter, it is fine. So now that M3G team received your letter, we will do two things. First of all, we will invite the contact person of the data supplier that is indicated in the data supplier letter to join the Airpos GNSS data provider or supplier committee. Rui mentioned this committee. It is one of the advisory committees of the consortium board of Airpos GNSS. And through that advisory committee, an Airpos data supplier can help shape the future of Airpos. Now, why did you not get an invitation if you're already a data supplier? The reason is simple. We are still setting it up. So in the course of this year, we will start to populate the data supplier committee. You know that we are still in a pilot operational phase. So we do everything step by step. And then the second thing we will do is we are going to proceed with inserting all the metadata in M3G, not we, the operational center, of course. So we will send an invitation to the operational center to complete all the metadata. If the operational center does not yet have an account in M3G, we will create the account. We will give the operational center the permission to submit stations to Airpos, because as long as we do not get a data supplier letter, existing operational centers can even not propose stations to Airpos in M3G. And then once the account is being created, the operational center can use the login button here to the upper right and log in M3G. And then you will get access to the submenu, the login submenu, which has two big parts, station metadata part and a general metadata part. The general metadata part, you have to insert all the information about agencies and contact persons. You know, something like GDPR, well, there is a reason why the general metadata is separated from the station metadata, because the general metadata is there to manage GDPR. We can discuss it later. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but everyone whose contact information is entered in M3G will get an email from us asking if they agree to make the contact information publicly available or not. If they do not agree, their name is removed everywhere from anything that is publicly available. So in the example here, where I logged in with the Aerobi account, you can see that we already inserted a couple of stations in M3G. So we will not go through all the parts of the SEP menu, but new M3G users, please check the quick start, or users who need to set up a new station, and you can go through the full documentation. It's quite detailed, and it is there to help you. And also the document procedure for including new GNSS stations in EPOS, which is the basis for this presentation, provides the details of what has to be entered in M3G. Just a quick remark, it is important to properly set up from the start if a station is a third-party station or not. Remember, this third-party station is a station for which the data supplier and operational center are different agencies, like the Belgian example I gave you. And after that, the operational center can insert for each station the data license and embargo time also in M3G. You can upload site logs from your local disk, or you can create them from scratch using an online form in M3G. When you upload them from your local disk, it is important to respect the IGS site log format, because if not, M3G will scramble everything up and have difficulties to read the site log. Also, the M3G APIs can be used to update site logs. And concerning the content of the site log, it is very important for the Airpos stations that the information in section 12, responsible agency of the site log, exactly corresponds to the agency of the data supplier, so that we really know this is the person is responsible for that station. Once the site log is validated, is completed, you can validate it. If it doesn't pass validation, you can correct it online, and once the validation is successful, you can submit it. You can also save a draft version if necessary. Now, you remember that Apos requires less details in a site log than, for example, URF and IGS. The rules that M3G will apply for validating the content of a site log will depend on the networks to which the station belongs. Now, for example, if a URF station is proposed to EPOS, then EPOS will apply for that station the stricter URF rules for validating the site log content to ensure that the station metadata will continue to fulfill the URF requirements. And by doing so, exactly the same site log will become available within URF as within EPOS. And for the stations common to Apos and URF, for example, the updated site log will then be automatically provided to the Apos data gateway on one hand and to the EPN Central Bureau to the other hand. And if the station belongs to the IGS will be notified that your site log has been updated, but we will not do the update at the IGS Central Bureau that you have still to do yourself. And then we come to the very last step. So all the operational center now inserted all the metadata in M3G. You notified us about that. And so now our team will inform Apos that we have new stations proposed. And we will say to Apos which are the data nodes where the station data will be made available. And at this point, your stations are now formally proposed to the Apos network, and their metadata are discoverable through the Apos delivery framework, meaning that people logging into Apos or looking at one of the Apos portals will see the metadata site log of your station. So now it is time to start providing the daily Bruyninx data to the selected Apos data node. Do not forget that you also have to provide, or do not forget, please, to also provide the historical data for your stations that are already installed since some time. And as soon as a significant amount of Bruyninx data are discoverable in Apos, your stations will be officially included in the Apos network. Now, for active stations which have a receiver and antenna installed, we expect minimally 4 weeks of recent data. Of course, possible embargo times are taken into account, and we can make exceptions for stations at remote locations unable to regularly submit data. For inactive stations, where no receiver or antenna is temporarily installed, or decommissioned stations, we request to make at least 3 years of data available. So we are still in a pilot operational phase, so all Apos stations are still labeled today as proposed to the Apos network. The stations indicated in green on this map, these are the stations for which we already have at least 4 weeks of Bruyninx data available through the Airpos data gateway. And during the course of this year, we will gradually move the stations that respond to the Airpos data availability requirements from proposed to included in the Airpos network. For these stations that are not yet making their data available, we will get in touch with them to assign the most optimal data node if this is not yet done, and help them to get the data flow started. It's worth mentioning, and Rui already mentioned it, that even if you provide your Bruyninx data to a data node, they will not necessarily be discoverable from the Airpos GNSS data gateway. This is because the data node will run the Anubis data quality software, which has been developed by the team of Yanduza. And if it discovers that the data quality is seriously degraded, or for example, the antenna type in the Bruyninx file header does not correspond with what is indicated in the station site log, it will not redistribute the data. So this is also an additional argument or an additional incentive for station managers to keep their site log up to date. So, but also in this way, Airpos is ensuring that all published data have passed some initial data quality check. So we come to the summary at the end of this presentation. I hope we were able to give you a clear overview of how to integrate the GNSS station in Airpos, so that we can start to fill the gaps in the European Airpos map. To summarize, we have the 7 steps. First, check if the station complies with the Airbus Guidelines. You know they are less strict than ERF and IGS. Secondly, you need to understand who is data supplier and who is the operational center, maintaining the station metadata in M3G. Third, it is necessary to prepare a list of stations. Fourth, you need to identify the Airpos data node who will make available your data to Airpos, and if you want to impose any restrictions on your data access, then complete the Airpos data supplier letter and provide it to the M3G team. Then put all the metadata in M3G, and finally make your Bruyninx data available to Airpos. So it was a very long presentation. I think it is in fact rather simple. Especially for those stations who already have their metadata in the M3G portal, because I told you we have 2,600 stations already with metadata in the M3G portal. And this is especially the case for EPN or EPN densification stations. Then for them, the procedure is much simpler. Especially for EPN stations, the main point will be to properly identify the data supplier and the operational center, and then just provide a completed Airpos data supplier letter to the M3G team. And that's it. But the data supplier letter has to be provided. EPN stations are not automatically included in Airpos. So I would like to thank you all for your attention. I would like to say that you were very quiet, but I know that you were all unmuted or muted, so it's very normal that you were quiet. Feel free to contact the GNSS team, the M3G team. You have our email address here, or me personally, and I am available to take questions.
Yeah. Okay. We had some questions in the chat. The first one by Roberto. Roberto Devotti. He will get the mic. He can talk to ask the question. I hope. Well, Leo. Otherwise, I read it. If he doesn't, he is not allowed to say it.
Do you hear me?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Then yes, I did that. I write down basically two questions. The first is I heard about the Anubis software, which is an important tool in making the quality check of the Bruyninx files. And I think it's substituting the TechQC software also. And so I'm wondering if it's maintained also in the future, and if this is the standard software for the quality check. And the second one is regarding the 4-character station name ID, which I think is currently is a problem that we have to manage, because in a number of countries there are indeed, and there are duplicate 4 characters names, and if we force them to change the 4 character names, this may introduce more confusion than adopting a 9-character name with the 2 numbers, I think the monument number or receiver numbers, which may be increased, and so having a 9-character unique name that will solve the problem. I see, for example, in Spain, there are names which are duplicated in the past, and then they changed the name. So the same station has now 2 4-characters name. So that is confusing. The same station have 2 names. I would prefer that the station maintain the 4-character name and increase, for example, the receiver number or the monument number in order to have the unique number. So also in Italy, we have a lot of stations which are duplicated, and they are obviously not treated in M3G log file because of this standard. So I think it's somehow urgent to solve this question and to allow to manage also these odd stations, let's say.
Okay. Carine.
I will try to respond quickly because I see we have no time left. The 9-character station ID, Apos is fully supporting it, and we want everyone to use it. That is not the issue. The issue is that even in the IGS level and the international level, the full chain from station to analysis center to products is not completely ready for it. And therefore, we discourage it. But in M3G, and you can have a look at in M3G, we have stations with the same 4-character abbreviation in different countries, of course. Also, the usage of 01 and not 00 for these middle 2 zeros. I know it is in the Bruyninx 3 standard, but it is not only depending on us. The international GNSS community is just not ready yet today for that. And from the M3G side, we are ready for that. I'm sorry if I'm trying to answer quickly. Your first question was about the support for Anubis. We are in close contact with the author of Anubis, Jan Douza, and Anubis is presently the best alternative we have for quality checking GNSS data, Bruyninx 3 data. I have no crystal ball, so I do not know if Jan Douza at the long term will continue doing this effort, but at the moment he is doing it, and since it is the only thing that we have available, this is what we are using. Anubis is also routinely used by UNAFCO. If I'm not mistaken, IGS will start using it.